June 15, 1944. The island of Saipan was the key to the next phase of the Pacific War. If the United States captured it, American bombers could strike the Japanese home islands directly. That made it one of the most heavily defended positions in the Marianas. Nearly 30,000 Japanese troops waited in fortified caves, concrete bunkers, and hidden artillery positions carved into volcanic rock. For the U.S. Marines preparing to land, the battle ahead would be brutal, close, and unforgiving. Among the thousands of Marines boarding landing craft that morning was a small, unusual platoon led by 29-year-old First Lieutenant Frank Tachovsky. On paper, his assignment made little sense. He commanded a scout sniper platoon within the Sixth Marine Regiment. But unlike other elite reconnaissance units, his men did not come from honor rolls or hand-picked academies. Many of them had recently been in the brig. Some had records of fighting, insubordination, or repeated disciplinary trouble. They were not the Marines officers proudly showcased during inspections. They were the ones usually kept out of sight. The Marine Corps of 1944 valued discipline above almost everything else: obedience, order, chain of command. Small units were expected to follow doctrine precisely. But Tachovsky had come to a different conclusion during training at Camp Tarawa in Hawaii. He had observed something uncomfortable. The Marines who caused problems in barracks were often the same men who showed initiative in the field. When two Marines fought, the loser might be hospitalized. The winner often went to the brig. Tachovsky reportedly wanted the winner. His idea was simple and controversial. Instead of building a reconnaissance platoon out of perfectly disciplined Marines, he would build one out of aggressive, independent thinkers, men who did not freeze when plans collapsed. Reconnaissance behind enemy lines required initiative. It required moving silently for days without direct supervision. It required making decisions without waiting for permission. Those qualities did not always align with parade ground perfection. Senior officers were skeptical. Some privately described the experiment as reckless. Sending former troublemakers behind enemy lines against a numerically superior and deeply entrenched enemy seemed like unnecessary risk. The Japanese military doctrine on Saipan emphasized defense in depth. Hidden artillery, interlocking fields of fire, and night infiltration tactics were designed to exhaust and isolate attacking forces. A small, undisciplined unit could easily be wiped out. Yet Tachovsky's platoon trained relentlessly. They practiced small unit movement, camouflage, long-range observation, and coordinated sniper fire. They rehearsed operating without resupply. They studied Japanese defensive patterns observed in earlier Pacific battles. Most importantly, they were given a degree of autonomy uncommon in standard Marine units. Orders emphasized objectives rather than rigid methods. The expectation was clear: complete the mission however you must. When the invasion began, naval bombardment thundered across Saipan's beaches. Battleships and cruisers fired thousands of shells into suspected defensive positions. But as earlier Pacific landings had shown, bombardment rarely eliminated deeply dug-in defenders. When the first waves of Marines approached the shore, they encountered heavy machine gun fire and pre-sighted artillery. Casualties mounted quickly. Tachovsky's platoon was not meant to stay on the beach. Their mission was different. After securing a foothold, they would move inland ahead of larger formations, identify enemy strongpoints, observe troop movements, and relay critical intelligence. In theory, this information would allow regimental commanders to maneuver more effectively and reduce casualties. In practice, it meant operating dangerously close to thousands of determined defenders. The scale of opposition was stark. Approximately 30,000 Japanese soldiers, including elements of the Imperial Japanese Army's 43rd Division, occupied the island. They had fortified high ground, prepared concealed firing ports, and established interconnected cave systems. The terrain itself, rocky ridges, sugarcane fields, and dense vegetation, favored defenders who knew every contour. For a small reconnaissance platoon, the margin for error was almost non-existent. Yet the very traits that had once caused disciplinary problems now became assets. Men accustomed to questioning authority were forced to rely on their own judgment. Aggression that once led to barracks fights translated into controlled initiative during patrols. Operating in teams of just a few Marines, they moved at night, observed by day, and avoided unnecessary engagements. Silence was survival. Their early missions tested the core assumption of Tachovsky's experiment. Could men once considered liabilities function independently under extreme pressure? Could they resist the urge for reckless confrontation and instead prioritize information gathering? The answer would determine not only their survival, but the success of larger marine operations pushing inland. As fighting intensified across Saipan, Japanese forces launched coordinated counterattacks, including infiltration attempts after dark. Small groups of enemy soldiers attempted to slip through American lines to create confusion and panic. For conventional units, such tactics were disorienting. For Tachovsky's men, who were already operating in small, fluid teams, adaptability was natural. Within days, reconnaissance reports from forward patrols began shaping tactical decisions. Identified artillery positions were targeted. Hidden defensive lines were mapped. Routes that would have exposed companies to enfilade fire were avoided. Intelligence gathered quietly, often within a few hundred yards of enemy positions, proved more precise than aerial observation alone. The gamble had not yet fully paid off. The battle for Saipan would last until July 9, 1944, and would include one of the largest banzai charges of the Pacific War. Casualties on both sides would be severe. But in those early days, amid smoke, shattered coral, and constant artillery fire, a controversial idea was being tested in real time. The Marine Corps believed elite units were forged through strict discipline and flawless records. Tachovsky believed something slightly different, that effectiveness behind enemy lines required independence, aggression, and trust in small unit decision-making. On Saipan, theory met reality, and the outcome would quietly influence how America thought about special operations for decades to come. The naval guns had been firing for days before the Marines ever touched the sand. Battleships and cruisers pounded the coastline of Saipan in what planners believed would cripple Japanese defenses. From offshore, it looked devastating. Columns of smoke rose from the cliffs, and entire sections of beach disappeared beneath explosions. But as the landing craft moved closer on June 15, 1944, a hard truth became clear. Most of the defenders were still alive. Hidden inside reinforced bunkers and deep cave systems, nearly 30,000 Japanese troops had survived the bombardment. They had constructed interlocking fields of machine gun fire that covered the most likely landing zones. Artillery pieces were pre-registered on the beaches. Mortars waited for tightly packed formations of Marines wading through surf. When the ramps of the landing craft dropped, chaos followed. Marines poured into chest-deep water under direct fire. Some never reached the sand. Others crawled forward, dragging wounded comrades behind shattered amphibious tractors. The beach quickly filled with smoke, debris, and confusion. Officers struggled to regroup scattered platoons. Communication lines broke down almost immediately. Somewhere in that storm was First Lieutenant Frank Tachovsky and his 40-man scout sniper platoon. Their mission was not to hold the shoreline, it was to move beyond it. Once a narrow beachhead was secured by the main assault companies of the 2nd Marine Division, Tachovsky received orders to push reconnaissance elements inland. The objective was simple in wording, but lethal in execution. Identify Japanese strongpoints, troop concentrations, and artillery positions before larger Marine units advanced into them blindly. The terrain ahead was a defender's advantage. Saipan's western coastline rose gradually toward ridges and broken high ground. Sugarcane fields limited visibility. Coral outcroppings provided natural cover for hidden firing positions. Beyond that lay Mount Tapachau, the island's dominant peak, offering observation over nearly the entire battlefield. Japanese doctrine emphasized defense in depth. Rather than contest every inch of beach, many defenders withdrew to prepared inland positions, drawing attackers into kill zones. This meant that the real battle would begin only after the shoreline fighting seemed to subside. Tachovsky divided his men into small teams, often just 4 or 5 Marines. They carried lighter loads than standard infantry, but packed extra ammunition and radios when available. Their instructions emphasized stealth and observation over engagement. Fire only if necessary, avoid detection, bring back information. It was an unusual order for Marines trained to close with and destroy the enemy. Moving inland required patience. During daylight, patrols used folds in the terrain and vegetation for concealment. At night, they advanced slowly, aware that Japanese units frequently conducted infiltration operations after dark. Unlike conventional companies that relied on fixed lines, these small teams navigated without clear front boundaries. The risk of friendly fire was real. Within the first days of operations, the platoon encountered its first major test. A forward patrol identified what appeared to be a lightly defended rise overlooking a planned Marine advance route. Closer observation revealed concealed firing slits cut into rock, nearly invisible from a distance. Machine gun barrels protruded only slightly. Without reconnaissance, advancing infantry would have been caught in direct crossfire. Instead, coordinates were relayed back. Naval gunfire and artillery were adjusted. When rifle companies moved forward, they did so with forewarning. Casualties, while still significant, were lower than they might have been. This pattern began to repeat. Hidden mortar pits were mapped. Camouflaged supply paths were noted. Patrols observed Japanese troop movements shifting toward threatened sectors. The information was not dramatic in isolation, but collectively it began shaping regimental decisions. Yet every patrol carried enormous risk. Japanese forces were experienced in jungle and island warfare. They understood concealment. Snipers targeted movement at long range. Patrols that lingered too long in one position invited counter-sniper fire or flanking maneuvers. One night, a small recon element found itself nearly encircled after detecting movement on 3 sides. Instead of engaging, the team remained motionless for hours, allowing enemy search parties to pass within yards. It was discipline of a different kind, not parade ground precision, but controlled restraint. The psychological strain was intense. Operating ahead of friendly lines meant knowing that immediate reinforcement was unlikely. Radio communication was unreliable amid terrain interference. Extraction under fire would be nearly impossible. Every decision carried amplified consequences. Meanwhile, the larger Battle of Saipan intensified. Japanese commanders launched counterattacks aimed at splitting Marine units before they could consolidate inland gains. Artillery duels echoed across the island. Casualty clearing stations filled rapidly. The fight was becoming one of attrition. In that environment, Tachovsky's unconventional platoon began to demonstrate the value of autonomy. Teams adjusted routes without waiting for new orders. If a path proved too exposed, they shifted. If enemy resistance was heavier than expected, they observed longer rather than charging forward. The initiative, once viewed as insubordination, became operational flexibility. Word of their effectiveness spread quietly through the regiment. Officers who had doubted the experiment began requesting updated reconnaissance before committing companies to difficult terrain. It did not mean the fighting became easier. Saipan would remain one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific Campaign, but it meant fewer surprises. By the end of the first critical phase of land operations, the platoon had operated repeatedly within close proximity to entrenched Japanese units. They had confirmed artillery sites, identified defensive gaps, and demonstrated that small, semi-independent teams could survive in contested space between front lines. The beachhead was no longer the center of danger. The fight had shifted inland, into caves and ridge lines where visibility was limited and resistance hardened. And Tachovsky's 40 men were already there, ahead of the main force, listening, watching, and quietly changing how the battle unfolded. The true test, however, was still coming. Japanese forces were preparing a massive final counterattack, and when it arrived, every lesson about independence, aggression, and survival would be pushed to its limit. By the third week of fighting on Saipan, the battle had changed character. The beaches were behind them. The easy lines on the maps no longer mattered. What remained was a brutal contest for ridges, caves, and shattered high ground. Japanese forces had withdrawn into the island's interior, transforming natural rock formations into defensive fortresses. Every advance required climbing toward unseen fire. For First Lieutenant Frank Tachovsky and his scout sniper platoon, this was the environment they had been built for. Traditional Marine doctrine emphasized coordinated company assaults supported by artillery and armor, but Saipan's terrain often neutralized those advantages. Tanks struggled in broken coral and steep slopes. Artillery could not always reach deeply embedded cave systems without precise coordinates. Infantry assaults without detailed reconnaissance risked walking directly into concealed kill zones. Tachovsky's men were already operating beyond the forward edge of friendly lines, sometimes hundreds of yards ahead, sometimes more. Their job was not simply to observe anymore. It was to penetrate, to test, to provoke small reactions and measure enemy response. They began using methods that were unconventional for standard infantry units. Instead of moving in predictable routes, they shifted patterns constantly. Instead of establishing obvious observation posts, they used temporary hides, never staying long enough to be triangulated by enemy fire. They avoided silhouette exposure along ridgelines. They studied Japanese habits, when patrols moved, when meals were likely prepared, when relief shifts occurred. Japanese defenders were disciplined and experienced. Many had fought in China or other Pacific campaigns. They relied heavily on camouflage and deception. False positions were created to draw American fire. Dummy guns were placed in visible spots while real weapons remained hidden. The scout sniper platoon learned quickly. If a position looked obvious, it was probably a decoy. If an area seemed too quiet, it demanded longer observation. Small teams sometimes split further. 2 Marines observing, while others maintained security behind them. Communication was limited to whispers or hand signals. Radios were used sparingly to avoid detection. Every movement had to be deliberate. On several occasions, patrols found themselves within extremely close range of Japanese positions, close enough to hear conversation, equipment movement, even coughing inside caves. Engagement was rarely the first choice. Information mattered more than kills. Identifying the exact entrance of a fortified tunnel could mean the difference between a costly frontal assault and a precisely targeted demolition.
But restraint did not mean passivity. When necessary, the platoon conducted silent eliminations of isolated sentries. Sniper fire was used selectively, not for volume but for effect. A single well-placed shot could delay an enemy patrol, create confusion, or force a defensive shift. The objective was always to shape the battlefield without revealing the full extent of their presence. The Japanese response grew more aggressive. Night infiltration tactics intensified. Small enemy groups attempted to slip through American lines to attack artillery positions and command posts. For conventional units resting behind the front, these attacks were disorienting and terrifying. For Tachovsky's men, who were already accustomed to fluid boundaries, the chaos was less paralyzing. They adapted quickly to operating in environments where the front line was not a straight line, but a constantly shifting zone. One patrol nearly ended in disaster when a sudden movement in brush triggered immediate rifle fire from concealed defenders. Instead of returning fire in panic, the team withdrew in staggered bounds, disappearing into broken terrain before the enemy could fix their position. It was controlled aggression, knowing when to strike and when to vanish. The pressure was relentless. Sleep came in short, tense intervals. Food was limited to what could be carried. Water discipline was critical under tropical heat. Any sign of fatigue increased vulnerability, yet morale within the platoon remained unusually steady. Part of that stability came from shared identity. These were Marines who had once been labeled problems. On Saipan, they were trusted with missions requiring the highest degree of independence. Responsibility replaced resentment. Performance replaced punishment. As the broader batter of Saipan approached its climax, Japanese commanders prepared a massive final counterattack, what would become one of the largest banzai charges of the Pacific War. Intelligence suggested growing troop concentrations in certain sectors. Tachovsky's forward elements observed increased movement at night, more messengers traveling between positions, more weapons being shifted. Reports were sent back warning of imminent large-scale action. When the attack finally came in early July, thousands of Japanese soldiers surged forward in a desperate attempt to break American lines. The fighting was savage and close. Entire Marine units were overrun before stabilizing. Casualties were heavy on both sides. In the aftermath, the importance of prior reconnaissance became clear. Units that had received early warning were better positioned. Fields of fire were adjusted. Defensive lines were reinforced where intelligence indicated likely pressure points. The scout sniper platoon had not stopped the charge alone. No single unit could have. But their pattern of deep reconnaissance, autonomous patrol work, and precise reporting had helped reduce uncertainty in an otherwise chaotic battle. By the time organized resistance on Saipan collapsed in July 1944, the cost was staggering. Thousands of Marines were killed or wounded. Japanese losses were even higher, with most of the defending garrison either killed in combat or during the final charge. Tachovsky's 40 men did not emerge untouched. They had faced sniper fire, near encirclement, and the constant threat of isolation. But the experiment had proven something undeniable. Elite capability did not come solely from spotless records or rigid conformity. It could also come from controlled independence, from men trusted to think and act without waiting for permission. What began as a controversial gamble had evolved into a working model of deep reconnaissance. Small teams operating ahead of conventional forces, shaping battles through information rather than mass. On a shattered island in the Marianas, amid coral dust and burned-out positions, a blueprint was forming. Not officially, not with ceremony, but through practice, adaptation, and survival. And that blueprint would not disappear when the guns on Saipan finally fell silent.
By mid-July 1944, organized resistance on Saipan was collapsing. The largest banzai charge of the Pacific War had already shattered against American lines. What remained were scattered pockets of defenders hiding in caves and remote ravines. For conventional Marine units, the battle was shifting from large-scale maneuver to systematic clearing operations. For First Lieutenant Frank Tachovsky and his Scout Sniper platoon, the mission did not slow down. In many ways, it became even more dangerous. With Japanese forces fragmented, the battlefield lost whatever predictability it once had. Small enemy groups operated independently, sometimes cutting supply routes or ambushing isolated patrols. Intelligence became more valuable than ever. Knowing which cave systems were still active, which ridge lines concealed holdouts, and where weapons caches were hidden could save dozens of lives. Tachovsky's platoon had already proven that small autonomous teams could survive ahead of conventional lines. Now they began refining something even more significant, a repeatable method of deep reconnaissance integrated directly into large-scale operations. Instead of treating reconnaissance as a preliminary phase before major assaults, their work demonstrated that recon had to be continuous. Patrols moved in cycles: observe, report, adjust, repeat. Information flowed upward quickly, shaping decisions at regimental level. Artillery targeting became more precise. Infantry advances were coordinated with updated intelligence rather than static maps. This approach differed sharply from earlier Marine doctrine, which often relied heavily on pre-assault bombardment and massed frontal pressure. Saipan showed that even overwhelming firepower could not neutralize a determined enemy embedded in complex terrain. Precision mattered. The lessons did not remain confined to one island. As operations continued across the Pacific theater, from the Marianas towards the Philippines and eventually Okinawa, the value of small, highly trained reconnaissance elements became clearer. Marine commanders increasingly recognized that decentralized initiative reduced uncertainty. Small teams operating independently could locate weaknesses, confirm enemy dispositions, and exploit opportunities faster than large formations waiting for detailed orders. What made Tachovsky's platoon distinctive was not just their skill, but their philosophy. They were given objectives, not scripts. If a patrol encountered unexpected resistance, they adapted. If a route became compromised, they shifted. Success depended on judgment at the lowest level. That idea, trust the operator on the ground, would later become foundational in U.S. Special Operations culture. In the years following World War II, the Marine Corps formalized deeper reconnaissance capabilities, eventually leading to the development of specialized units such as force reconnaissance companies. These units emphasized long-range patrols, independent action, and insertion behind enemy lines, concepts proven viable during battles like Saipan. The Navy would also pursue similar evolution. Underwater demolition teams during World War II had already begun experimenting with unconventional maritime operations. Over time, these efforts contributed to the creation of the United States Navy SEALs in 1962. While the SEALs emerged from naval special warfare roots, the broader doctrine of small unit autonomy, deep reconnaissance, and flexible mission execution had been shaped by earlier Pacific experiences. Saipan was not the sole origin of modern special operations, but it was part of a critical pattern. It demonstrated that elite capability required more than discipline. It required adaptability under isolation. For the Marines in Tachovsky's platoon, recognition at the time was limited. There were no grand announcements declaring a revolution in doctrine. War rarely pauses to celebrate innovation in the middle of battle. But officers who witnessed the impact understood its significance. Reports from Saipan emphasized the value of forward reconnaissance. Commanders began requesting dedicated scout sniper and recon elements earlier in operational planning. Training programs placed greater emphasis on independent decision-making under stress. Perhaps most importantly, the stigma surrounding Tachovsky's original recruitment philosophy began to fade. The men once seen as disciplinary risks had demonstrated controlled aggression in precisely the environment that demanded it. They had not operated recklessly, they had operated intelligently. This subtle shift mattered.
Military culture often prioritizes uniformity for good reason. Cohesion and reliability are critical in combat. But Saipan suggested that strict conformity alone could not solve every battlefield problem. Some missions required individuals capable of functioning without constant oversight. As the Pacific War continued into 1945, amphibious assaults grew larger and more complex. Casualties mounted in battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The need for precise intelligence before committing massed forces became undeniable. Deep reconnaissance units were no longer experimental, they were essential. The blueprint was clear. Small teams, carefully selected, extensively trained, operating with autonomy, tasked with shaping the battlefield before the main force engaged. The irony remained striking. What began as an unconventional experiment, recruiting men from brigs and punishment details, had contributed to a transformation in how the U.S. military viewed elite operations. Initiative was no longer a liability. Properly guided, it was an asset. By the time Saipan was secured on July 9, 1944, the strategic consequences were enormous. The island's airfields soon hosted B-29 bombers capable of striking the Japanese mainland. The Pacific War entered a new phase. But beneath that strategic victory lay a quieter evolution. On the ridges and in the shadows of caves, a small platoon had tested the limits of independence in combat. They had shown that deep reconnaissance, silent movement, and decentralized command were not theoretical ideals, they were practical necessities. Decades later, when modern special operations forces would deploy in small teams across distant battlefields, operating far from conventional support, the principles would feel familiar. Trust the team, define the objective, adapt to the ground truth, survive independently. On Saipan, those principles were not written in manuals, they were written in experience.
The Battle of Saipan had officially ended on July 9, 1944, but the island still bore the scars of relentless fighting. Craters, shattered bunkers, and twisted metal littered the ridges and valleys. Smoke from lingering fires drifted over the sugarcane fields, and the air smelled of gunpowder and salt. Thousands of Japanese soldiers had died or committed ritual suicide, and American casualties were heavy. Yet amid the chaos, a small, unusual group of Marines had quietly left its mark on the outcome. 40 men, led by First Lieutenant Frank Tachovsky, recruited from the brig and tasked with operations behind enemy lines. At first glance, their role might seem small compared to the massive assaults by regimental and division-level forces, but the intelligence they gathered, the observations they made, and the positions they mapped were invaluable. These 40 men, once considered troublemakers, had operated deep in enemy territory, moving silently through terrain where a misstep could be fatal. They had observed Japanese troop movements, identified hidden artillery, and transmitted details that directly influenced how commanders deployed thousands of other Marines. Every day, they faced the kind of danger that would have immobilized conventional units. The platoon's success was not measured in dramatic charges or headline-making feats, but in precision, patience, and adaptability. Each Marine had to make independent decisions constantly. Should they advance toward an enemy-held ridge or find an alternate path? When an unexpected patrol approached, should they engage or wait for it to pass? Every choice carried immediate consequences, and yet they survived and succeeded in an environment designed to kill anyone operating outside conventional formations. By the end of the battle, the Marines had learned to blend into the landscape almost invisibly. They observed enemy routines, noted the locations of hidden caches, and identified isolated units that could be neutralized efficiently. One report described a team shadowing a Japanese supply convoy through rugged terrain, relaying its movements so artillery could strike at the precise moment without exposing American infantry. Another detailed how a pair of Marines had silently eliminated a forward sentry, allowing an entire company to move without detection.
These small actions, repeated over and over, accumulated into operational advantage, saving lives and reducing uncertainty for the main force. The irony was striking. These were men the Marine Corps had once labeled as problematic, insubordinate, aggressive, or unfit for traditional assignments. On Saipan, the very traits that had landed them in brigs became the foundation of their effectiveness. Their independence, their ability to improvise, their willingness to operate in morally and physically ambiguous situations, these qualities turned them from liabilities into a force multiplier. What military manuals emphasized as discipline and obedience had its limits. In the jungle and volcanic ridges of Saipan, initiative was the deciding factor. After the battle, official recognition was minimal. Reports noted the success of reconnaissance, but few mentioned the controversial origins of the platoon or the extreme risk they had assumed. Yet within the Marine Corps, officers who had observed the platoon's operations understood their significance. The lessons were quietly absorbed. Elite capability could not rely solely on conformity. Small, flexible units with independent thinking could shape the battlefield in ways large formations could not. The 40 Thieves, as some informally called them, had demonstrated that unconventional recruitment could produce unconventional results. This experience laid the groundwork for future developments in U.S. Special Operations. Marine Force Reconnaissance, established after World War II, inherited the principles tested on Saipan: small teams, deep reconnaissance, autonomy, and adaptability. The Navy, meanwhile, integrated similar lessons into its underwater demolition units. By the 1960s, these threads converged into the United States Navy SEALs, elite units capable of operating independently behind enemy lines, using the very principles first demonstrated by Tachovsky's platoon. The impact was cultural as well as operational. Saipan challenged traditional notions of what makes an elite soldier. It was no longer only about immaculate discipline or physical perfection. It was about judgment under pressure, mental resilience, and the ability to operate without constant supervision. The Marines who had been written off as troublemakers became a model for harnessing human potential in high-risk environments. In many ways, the story of Saipan's scout sniper platoon remained hidden because the nature of their work was invisible to the casual observer. Their victories were measured not in headlines, but in the lives saved, in battles redirected, and in plans informed by precise intelligence. When senior officers requested patrol reports before committing companies to high-risk areas, they were relying on these men, the same ones who had once been dismissed as liabilities. The legacy extended beyond the battlefield. Their story influenced military doctrine, training methods, and the philosophy of small unit leadership. Decades later, modern special operations forces continue to operate under principles first proven on Saipan: mission-focused autonomy, rapid decision-making, and the integration of intelligence with tactical operations. The environment may have changed. Mountains replaced islands, deserts replaced jungles, but the underlying principles remain the same. By the end of their deployment, Tachovsky's 40 men had survived what seemed impossible. They had operated with minimal oversight, faced overwhelming odds, and influenced the course of one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific. Their success was a testament to adaptability, courage, and unconventional thinking. In doing so, they quietly changed how the Marine Corps and Navy would approach elite operations for decades to come. Even today, the lessons of Saipan echo in modern training and operations. The principle is simple but profound. The most effective operators are not always those who follow rules perfectly. They are those who can think, act, and survive independently, even in the most extreme circumstances. The 40 Marines who once seemed destined for failure had proven that controlled initiative, resilience, and trust in individual judgment could rewrite the rules of combat. In the ruins of Saipan, amid chaos and fire, a quiet revolution had taken place, one that would shape the future of elite military operations forever.